Here, my name is Shlomo Swidler, CEO of Orchestratus, and I'll get a slide up here while I try to do that. We asked earlier how many people in the audience are using or developing OpenStack. Can we see hands again? So that's about 40% of you. Now the room is about full, so that's around 400 people. And of the people who are developing and using OpenStack, how many of you are developers as opposed to operations? How many are developers? Okay, most of that. And how many of you are operations people, keeping things running, but not necessarily developing new code? Minority. Okay. Maybe 5%. Okay. So I'd like to invite up our panel. Okay. So our panel today, it consists of members from, let's see if I can remember this, Mac Divine from IBM, and Mark McLean from DreamHost. Are you here, Mark? Okay, come on down. Here we go. Mark Collier from the OpenStack Foundation. Great. And Chris Jackson from Rackspace. And Sivan Barzilai, who we just saw from Alcatel. Okay, so we've heard from all of you except for you, Mark, from DreamHost, but you're on after lunch, so I'm not going to ask you to talk about your special secret sauce. What I would like to start off asking is, who is using OpenStack? What kinds of industries, what kinds of use cases? We heard a little bit about that. Who, in your experience, who are you dealing with who's using OpenStack?
Sure. Can you hear me? All right. So I'm Mark Collier with the OpenStack Foundation. I think that we do see a lot of users in a lot of different industries. In particular, I would say e-commerce is one of the ones that I see most often. We have talked about PayPal. Jonathan this morning talked about PayPal using OpenStack and eBay. Actually, they're somewhat separate, even though they're part of one company. But eBay is another big user of OpenStack, and then Mercado Libre, which is the 8th largest e-commerce site in the world. So one of the reasons I think it's interesting to see e-commerce companies using it is because they're running their entire business on infrastructure. In some sense, their business is infrastructure, especially for PayPal. And so for them, it's really not an option to rely on something that is not going to be reliable, that they can really handle. And I think we heard from LivePerson today as well, which is I guess you could consider a SaaS application. And so these are all companies who their whole business depends on staying online and being responsive. And the other pattern we see is just the discussion all morning about speed. And get moving faster is not just about kind of making it less of a hassle for developers and making them happier. It's also about creating more value for your business. And so, we've heard from PayPal, for example, at our summit last month, that when they allow their developers to move more quickly, they can actually introduce new products and services to the market more quickly, faster than their competitors. So it becomes a competitive advantage. So those are just a couple of, I guess, industries that we see quite a bit of interest in. Big deployments.
So you're seeing the industries that you're seeing, e-commerce and also more traditional enterprises, SaaS, they're running production deployments on top of OpenStack?
Yeah, absolutely.
And we saw Mac, your presentation earlier, and Chris, you mentioned that about 75% of things are involved in succeeding in cloud are not related to technology. Now, Rackspace is a member of the OpenStack Foundation, and what are you doing? What is the OpenStack Foundation doing to encourage success with things outside the technology?
Anyone else want to take this? Well, I think that's a good question. I think when you think about the way that OpenStack functions as a community, a big part of that is our 6-month development cycle, which is tied very much to these summits that happen every 6 months. So the software comes out, a new release, we've always released them on time, every 6 months, and then a couple of weeks later, somewhere in the world, we get together and plan the next release. And so a lot of times, when you think about the 2,600 people that were in Portland, they weren't all there to talk about what should go in the code. They were actually there as much to share best practices about how, for example, operators are operating these clouds, and I think that sharing of knowledge is every bit as important, if not more important, than the sharing of the code itself. So we talk about open source, and there's a lot of emphasis on the source, being source code, but a lot of it is about the open community. And to give you an example, I guess a more specific example of what the foundation has done, and again, we hate to take credit for anything that the community is doing, because we're just there to facilitate it. But we facilitated the production of this OpenStack operations guide. We basically just kind of help coordinate and bring together these authors from Australia and a lot of other places into Austin, Texas for a week to write a book. And so, getting that type of knowledge on paper, as well as the knowledge transfer that happens in person with summits and meetings like this, to try to make sure that 75% is absolutely a part of what we're helping to get that knowledge out there. And if you go to our website, I think Jonathan got a few plugs in for OpenStack that are this morning, but we have quite a bit of content now, a lot of videos, tutorials, and we're trying to get more of that kind of content in the hands of users and have them sharing that knowledge.
Okay, sounds reasonable. As we know, the hard part of keeping an application is what happens to it after it's mostly done being developed. You spend the bulk of the effort, of course, up front specifying and getting those initial deployments out, but then you run the long road, the long game of keeping it running, keeping patches flowing, keeping it operated, keeping it up. And the same is the case with OpenStack. And something that I hear from some members of the audience here today, as well as other customers, is that OpenStack is hard to operate. OpenStack is hard to upgrade. What can we do about that?
I'd be happy to take it.
I'm not putting you specifically on the spot. Anybody?
I'll say one thing, and I'm going to throw this at someone to see who catches it. I think the best thing we can do is listen to the users and empower them and bring them, together here. We heard from a live person. I think that if you look at how the project has evolved, there's been quite a big change in the things that are being worked on in the last 6 months, and that's because lots of people are using it in production. And when they use it in production, they find out what's wrong, they find out how it can be better, and then they come and voice that. And as long as we're giving them a voice, the community, including the developer community, which there are a lot of people here that are involved in that, are very, very responsive. So it's really about kind of giving people a voice, and then the software is evolving in that direction. So for example, the upgrade, what I've heard from a lot of users is that upgrades have been very difficult in the past, but moving from Folsom to Grizzly is much, much easier. All right, volunteer.
Yeah, so some of this is that we're kind of getting spoiled, because if you go back in time when communities started to come together, like Linux community, it took years for it to reach a maturity where you could get it in production. The rate and pace at which OpenStack has matured has been significantly better. And it's almost like candy. You can't get enough of it, So people's expectations are way up. I do think that we're making, to Mark's point, our experience inside the labs was it was a significant improvement, both from an operation standpoint and from a migration standpoint, going from Essex to Folsom, and then Folsom to Grizzly. Folsom to Grizzly was a lot easier. It was a lot more. The migration was easier. The operations, being able to manage an environment utilizing Grizzly, was a lot easier. So things are getting better, but expectations are also running a lot higher too.
Do you think that the composition of the user group, of the users and members and contributors to OpenStack accurately reflects the amount of effort that has to go in to improving the operability of OpenStack? In other words, when I look at the OpenStack Foundation members and contributors, I see a lot of developers. I don't see a lot of operators.
So, yeah, kind of unique because we're primarily a developer, but I work for DreamHost. We're a deployer of OpenStack. And so it's kind of completing that circle a little bit of getting information back from the folks deploying and taking some of the questions. Internally, I get them from our deployment staff who will say, they'll ask questions of why do we make these certain decisions, and then you explain. Or developers also a lot of times will take shortcuts because it works in their environment, but it doesn't scale very well depending on different kinds of hardware because they're only testing one unique deployment. So one of the things we try to educate within our core review team is making sure that when we're reviewing code, that we're taking in consideration how it's going to be deployed. Is it simple to configure? If taking OpenStack, especially networking out of the box, how can you get it up and running as quick as possible without having 4,000 different knobs and buttons and switches to turn to even make it run? And one of the things we talked about is you talked earlier about migrations between versions, making those easier. One of the things we're also taking a look at in Havana is how do we make networking simpler? Because we take a look at the feedback from the mailing list, just from regular users and questions, to kind of gauge either filing bugs or adding features to simplify that process.
So, Chris, at Rackspace, you guys run some large OpenStack deployments. You mentioned in your talk that you keep the entire infrastructure, you keep your entire environment about 2 weeks behind OpenStack Trump without incurring user downtime. Can you share with us that special sauce? We want to do that too.
There's two kind of levels to this. Part of it is enabling the community to do those kind of pieces at the scale they're running at. And then there's the challenges that Rackspace have running this at web scale with thousands and thousands of nodes. So some of the things that we do and the processes we have to go through are symptomatic of the situation we found ourselves in, where we had an old cloud based on an acquisition of a company called SliceHost. We then added OpenStack into that June, July of 2012. A lot of this is understanding how we can take the bits that are really useful in the community, extract those and make those available. So what you see with our private cloud software is definitely a different version of OpenStack's cloud. Is it actually working? Sorry. Can you hear me back?
That's better. So what we're seeing is in Rackspace's private cloud software, a push and a drive to make some of that technology more available and more consumable without requiring you to make the investments in infrastructure and complexity that are associated with the public cloud. So when we talk about our continuous integration and deployment process, some of the things you'll see from Rackspace across the course of the next 12 months or so is making that simpler and easier to consume in the private cloud model, where you can go and take that off the shelf and go and wrap Rackspace's support around it.
So in other words, we can't see what you're doing.
Not just yet. There is plenty of work. You can go and look on our blog. You can look at the ways that we operate things. We're very much an open business in terms of explaining how we utilize the technology. But there's an element of relativeness and how relevant it is to people's businesses in the private cloud world. There's a danger of massively overcomplicating But we take a lot of the standard practices that the OpenStack Foundation themselves use with the way that they test and then push code straight into their own software provisioning systems.
So, your Rackspace, the Rackspace operates private clouds as well as public clouds. If I remember correctly, the mission of OpenStack is to encourage a flourishing ecosystem of interoperable cloud providers. Yes?
Yep.
Okay. What does Rackspace think of that vision in which it's encouraging competition to explore business?
It's something that we feel really quite comfortable with. Our vision and our goal has always been open technology and open standards. If you look beyond OpenStack and look at what we're doing with the Open Compute Foundation, for example, our goal here is to open all the ways that you run, manage, and build clouds. What that leaves us is only one place we can hide, which is the quality of our support and service you're going to go buy from us. We believe in open source, but we also believe in an open business model where you can take all the things you need to work with Rackspace without becoming locked into Rackspace. We want the one thing that defines whether you rate us or hate us to be the quality of our service. And if at some point in the future you don't agree that our service is really worth the money, that you can disconnect that link, but you can take all the technology, all the time you've made building your business around the cloud and OpenStack and take that somewhere else.
So you're saying that you're putting your money behind Fanatical support?
100%.
Fanatical support only supports Rackspace or any OpenStack?
At the moment, it's supporting Rackspace's OpenStack private cloud software, and obviously hybrids off into our public cloud as well. One of the things that makes Fanatical support Fanatical is consistency at scale. If we enabled 100 or 1,000 or 1 million customers to all come in and run their own particularly bespoke version of OpenStack, we set ourselves up for an ability where you might get a good experience 1 time out of 10, but we are making our name and making promises to you based on being high quality 10 times out of 10. So having some level of consistency in how we expect those clouds to operate and behave is absolutely key to delivering a strong experience for customers.
So I'm going to mention a word that was mentioned seldom today, Amazon. And I'm actually surprised. Was anyone counting how many times someone mentioned Amazon Web Services? I counted. It was once. On one slide there was the emblem of Amazon Web Services on Sivan's slide. Why? Why aren't we talking about Amazon anymore?
How many times do you think they mentioned OpenStack at the Amazon conference?
Amazon.
Just curious.
That's a great question. Amazon themselves probably didn't mention OpenStack at the conference, but Amazon is the gorilla in the room.
Well, one of the things you have to remember, having gone to many of these conferences before, the number of Amazon references have gotten less and less because of the amount of OpenStack references and the use cases that exist. Before, you were talking theoretical with OpenStack, and therefore you had to have some kind of reference point, and so you pointed at Amazon. Now you have real use cases that are based off of OpenStack, so I want to talk about those because those are much more relevant in terms of a sustainable strategy, in terms of being an open cloud kind of a strategy is the only one that's truly going to be sustainable.
I think to add to that as well, if you think about the level of maturity that sits around understanding cloud now, people are seeing that whilst Amazon and OpenStack may appear in the same sort of customer arenas, they serve very different functions. They are chalk and cheese in terms of one gives you a black box, this is what you're going to consume and here's how you're going to consume it. OpenStack gives you that freedom and flexibility to build what you want, how you want it, wherever you want it. And a lot of people will still value that level of flexibility and the ability to go and get those same services from multiple vendors without having to worry about, well, what happens if Amazon do a complete U-turn tomorrow?
So are you seeing...
So only one thing to add to that. What we see is not just the ability to develop, as you said, but sometimes some customers and some use cases would want to consume something that is ready out of the box. So that would be the reason for Amazon on my slide. But we believe being completely open means not saying no to any of the possibilities. We did see that Amazon's popularity has decreased and the services are not as popular as they used to be. And it makes sense. We believe this trend will continue. However, being open means that if at some point this capability should be leveraged, that it is possible to do so.
So, are you seeing in your adoption of OpenStack, both in your own companies and in the ecosystem, are you seeing it displace other technologies? Are you seeing it push out VMware? And what kind of deployments are being supplanted by OpenStack?
From the experience we've seen, the people that should be most concerned about this move to cloud are VMware. I think that one of the challenges, and I mentioned it in my presentation, is it's just not a lift and shift from VMware to OpenStack. It's that full-blown transformation. How well VMware manage that transformation for their existing client base is for them to solve for. But I believe that people are looking for alternatives, and an open, no-license model approach to cloud is certainly something of value. But yeah, the thing we both love and we struggle with at the same time is working with customers who need to make that full-blown transformation from, I know I need cloud, but I'm currently here with my big VMware estate and my traditional legacy applications. How do I go and activate the benefits in the short term, whilst I know that long term I can start to re-architect?
Yeah, just one more thing on that. Even in the accounts where they're just so dominantly kind of locked into an existing implementation, whether they're utilizing a public cloud like Amazon and locked into the service or a private cloud like VMware, there's been a significant shift over the last 12 months in particular where all new projects are going towards non-lock-in kind of approach. So they use them in combination with one another. So there's a shift away as, especially lines of business kind of applications, new applications that need to engage with customers, applications that need to have some kind of aspect of mobile. Instead of them trying to figure out how they can extend those locked-in environments, they're implementing those in an open fashion. So I think that trend will definitely continue. And that would be a lot of pressure on both VMware on the private side and Amazon on the public side to become much more open-oriented. Otherwise, it's not a sustainable path. And that's one of the reasons why you see on the VMware side they spun off Pivotal with Cloud Foundry and Big Data, and they kind of de-emphasize the whole VMware lock-in thing. So we'll see how they go about doing that.
Okay, I want to take questions. Please.
So Amazon are nevertheless the elephant in the room. Would you see that the OpenStack development roadmap mostly follows up on whatever services Amazon provides and trying to catch up with the compute, the storage, the database as a service, whatever? Or do you see the roadmap as completely independent of whatever Amazon are already offering?
So the question is, how tied is the OpenStack development roadmap to what Amazon does in the ecosystem?
Well, I think there's certainly some correlation. I mean, Amazon kind of blazed a trail, if you will, around infrastructure as a service, and it would be a detriment to the community if we didn't follow that trail to a certain degree. And that certainly was true in the early days of OpenStack. In terms of, we saw the mistakes, we saw the successes, and we made sure we went down the right path. And I think that's one of the reasons why OpenStack has caught up so much to where Amazon is. From this point forward, I think listening to the ecosystem, the community of OpenStack is equally important than just following, the breadcrumbs that Amazon has. I also think that as Amazon has matured, they started doing lock-in even above the infrastructure with some of the services they have, versus the OpenStack approach, which, you want a database as a service technology. There's a wide variety of vendors that are in the OpenStack ecosystem that you can choose from. And depending on the month, this vendor may be a whole lot further ahead than this other vendor. So the ability to not be locked into service that is that's going to only innovate at the rate and pace of that individual service versus being able to look at how to tap into the community and have a set of APIs and an infrastructure that set of APIs and services can gravitate around, I think is going to be extremely important as we move forward.
Did that answer your question?
Almost all the speakers mentioned that it's time to develop the applications in a new fashion, in a new way. What's the roadmap for supporting enterprise applications? If I have Oracle, even two applications that are already mature and run for years, what is the roadmap for OpenStack for those applications?
So the question is, what does OpenStack see as the future for supporting existing legacy enterprise applications that are based on stacks that are not cloud ready?
Yeah, so I would say that to kind of tie these two things together, the way that OpenStack roadmap is being pulled forward in the future is by the users, as we were talking about earlier, and many users, in fact, who are building private clouds for enterprises will say, okay, we used it for all these new applications, we used it for everything that works well in virtualization, we love this, we want to use it everywhere. Oh, well, where is it not quite a fit? Maybe it's an Oracle database. And so a couple of things we see on the roadmap are bare metal provisioning, which is actually part of the solution today. And so that's something that is appropriate in some cases when you want to run something like a database and you need the maximum performance without virtualization. And what was the other one? Dang it, there was one other thing. I'm sorry, I forgot. Oh yeah, it was brilliant though.
So is bare metal provisioning enough to get your legacy applications into cloud?
Everybody mentioned that legacy applications require high availability, but right now they cannot get from OpenStack, or should get from OpenStack as well, let's say. And it's not only about performance, there are other ways to get performance. As you guys mentioned, the high availability is something that is needed to be taken care of by new applications or legacy applications that is not.
Right. So in other words, you didn't answer the question. Legacy applications need more than performance. Legacy applications, by definition, rely on the hardware for high availability, and cloud relies on commodity hardware, which does not have HA built in. How do we get there? Not necessarily. How do we get there?
So let me tell you what we do. When we're talking about not just legacy applications, but sometimes other applications as well that require not necessarily, I wouldn't define it as necessarily hardware dependency, but rather they can't look at a cloud as just a cloud. It can't just be in one centralized location. It can't not be aware where deployments occur. It can't not provide high availability. So all of this has to be addressed. And what we did in Alcatel-Lucent is we added another layer that can manage a cloud and look at the different components in it, making sure that we can get to a state where every application can be onboarded to this cloud. So whether it's location awareness or high availability that can be reached in a non-single point of failure way, whether it's leveraging networks or other capabilities of your cloud nodes, these all have to be taken into consideration as we see it to enable onboarding of the different applications that are not as simplified as the one we've handled so far.
So you took a look at applications and found that they need more than just availability, and you're putting that on top of OpenStack? Open source?
Well, what we are doing is we believe that you have to rely on something and not leveraging a standard that is turning to be very popular inside the industry and community. Not leveraging open source products and reinventing the wheel over and over again just to get an addition makes no sense. And so we think, sorry?
Your edition open source, that was my question.
Right, but what we can do is we can look at just the basic.
No?
Well, all right, sorry, I didn't answer that. I thought it was a joke because it's obvious Alcatel-Lucent doesn't do it. But no, so
You heard it here, folks.
I'm sorry. CloudBand is not open source. It's not, well, it relies and contributes to different open sources underneath. And so what we have done and what we're continuing to do is we think some of the problems that have been answered with the initial releases of OpenStack, some of them are being addressed with additional components like quantum and heat and other areas that are being handled as we go along. But on top of all of that, we have to remember that just because something does not suffice for the needs of a specific application, it doesn't mean that it can't be used and leveraged. And so, well, at least what we are doing to recommend this path is we enhance the current available open source. So OpenStack being one of them. And when the standard did not yet meet what we needed, when the open source did not yet include what was required, we added extension to that. And we added some other handling of knowledge areas that were not handled yet. And so, right, not everything that you add would necessarily make its way back to the open source, but you can definitely leverage the open source and make sure that you don't have to reinvent the wheel. You don't have to do something that was done before, and instead you can focus on your special sauce to deliver your applications.
So what you're saying is, yeah, please.
So Florian Haas over here is jumping out of his seat because he has done a ton of work to help people deploy OpenStack in high availability configurations, and it's all open source, and it's all, you know, there's talks on his website. I think he talks at a number of events. I don't know if he's talking today, maybe, hopefully.
Today, about that.
Okay, but you know, there are a lot of people who want to deploy OpenStack in high availability, and a lot of people that are, and a lot of those that knowledge is out there in the community. And Florian's one of the folks that's leading that effort. And you know, I think one of the things that sometimes people get confused about OpenStack, particularly when it is compared with Amazon, is that yes, it can power very large public clouds, but it can also be used in many, many different ways. And so a lot of people do deploy it in a high availability. And just because you can run it on commodity hardware doesn't mean you have to run it on commodity hardware. So that's one of the things that gets confused sometimes, is that we try to describe it concisely, but then you inevitably leave out, you know, a lot of the possibilities that actually happen. And I think to your point, you know, we're starting to see and hear from all these users now, and why we talk about OpenStack, these OpenStack events, because every user is doing something a little bit different. And if we give them the mic and we hear from, you know, live person and so forth, you know, we find out how they're doing it. And there are a lot of people that are starting to deploy it. And I also remember the thing that I forgot earlier, which is another feature that's being worked on in the community is the ability to deploy a single VM to a whole host machine, which is, you know, again, a little more
Single tenants.
Yeah, which is, you know, interesting for some of those.
Yeah, I think another thing you have to remember is those legacy applications are still, there's development teams behind them. And those development teams have taken notice that they were going to have to reshape the way they do their applications and reshape their architecture so that it's more conducive to cloud. Because otherwise they're not going to survive long term. So like as an example, inside IBM, you mentioned DB2 as an example, okay? As soon as IBM joined the OpenStack community and I set up a project in my Cloud First Factory lab, I had 583 developers in the information management organization onboarding different projects to figure out how they can make you know, DB2 more of the database as a service, making it more aligned with what we're doing with OpenStack. And I'm sure that, you know, that examples across the board for different applications that are still very actively developed. Now, for some of the other legacy applications that don't have an active development shop, you know, I think, you know, those are going to kind of be square pegs round holes in many cases. So you kind of have to make the best do as you can. But I think you'll see moving forward, in particular, these kind of traditional online transactional processes kind of applications being adapted and reshaped so they can be very conducive to OpenStack.
VM, make it highly available, I don't want to care about it, let me stuff my application into this. And we can actually do that in Grizzly, it's just not pretty yet. It's just going to improve as we go along, but there's a lot of change that has happened in Grizzly that enables that, and we just need to make it, nicer.
So, what does nicer mean? You said we need to make it easier to get.
Integrate better with management facilities, with the CLI, with Horizon. It just needs to become nicer. We have to have an ability to say, okay, this is my guest, and I want to check a box and say, can we make this thing available?
Do you want to take a seat?
Come on down.
Come on.
You're the next.
Florian Haas.
So about this HA bit, and this is something that I basically am confronted with on a pretty much daily basis. What people are obviously interested in is as we move to, as we see more and more data centers move to an OpenStack-based cloud, what people would like to do is they would say, give me a VM, make it highly available, let me stuff my application into it. Because for many shops, that's a requirement because it's not practical to re-engineer 304 different applications that a relatively small team is managing. And it's an illusion to think that they can all be re-architected on a more cloudy scale. And now in Grizzly, we thankfully have many, many features in OpenStack that enable us to do these kind of things. But right now, many of these implementations, number one, they're not very unified, and number two, some of them are not very pretty, and I can give you examples about that as we chat in the hallways. My talk here today is about Ceph and not about HA, but I'll be happy to share thoughts on that. So do I understand the question correctly? If I'm deploying my application with Puppet or Chef or whatnot, what difference is it whether I'm running it on an Iron Wires data center or when I'm running it in the cloud, right? Is that the question? Well, if we are that far, it's wonderful. But what I don't know about you guys here, but what I'm confronted with on a daily basis is people that are running like really, really old legacy applications that are 5 years old, and they would be happy if they could even P2B it. And we're not even talking about orchestration or system automation or whatnot. And we would like to give them...
Let's ask the audience.
Yes, sir.
Who here is running a collection of applications that they would love to be able to move into virtualization? Let's forget about cloud for a second. They're stuck on physical hardware.
Yeah.
Well, this is an OpenStack conference, so most of you know. Okay.
Can I just follow up on that? It's not just bare metal versus cloud. Like virtual providing abstraction, physical hardware where you can migrate the VM, storage. I think these are the main features that I'm needing. I want that service running. It's a single VM, it's not a complex application. I need it running. I don't care about the underlying.
Yeah, and what you saw, for example, from Zen Server or from VMware vCenter, you had a checkbox that said, make this thing highly available. And then you didn't have to care about what it's doing underneath. How far are we? I think we're about 80% of the way, which means we only have the other 80% left to do. No, I think we're having interesting discussions about what's the best way to implement it. We sort of want to come up with the best way to implement it. And there's a few contenders in there, or technologies that are sort of contenders for this that polarize. Some people love them, some people hate them. So it's just an ongoing developer discussion.
How about OpenStack internal that is VM running?
Okay, so are you talking, so the question was OpenStack internals that need to be machine high level? Are you talking about the OpenStack infrastructure? That is, okay, so services like relational database, message broker, and then API services and whatnot. That's a done deal. We can do that today. That's simple. The hard part that's still left is the I want to make a machine highly available. Against another guess.
Yeah, so high availability has been mentioned quite a lot, but there are quite a few other barriers to getting certain applications into the cloud. Siobhan mentioned some. To me, those are exactly the things we need to work on in OpenStack to get more applications into the cloud. But I'm interested in the panel's view on what is missing, what are these barriers, and what should we be doing moving forward.
So, high availability was mentioned. I would like to say that we're talking about not just high availability in the machine level, but also just ensuring that there is no single point of failure to an application deployment. We're also talking about the characteristics of the deployment itself. So whether it is the availability level or the service level that has to be supported. Sometimes locations do matter. Sometimes you have to be location aware. There is the matter of complying with standards for deploying specific applications. So we have to know the infrastructure we're running on. Yes, it sounds like it's the opposite of what cloud should do, but sometimes it's what we have to do. There is the network activity, which has been handled quite well in the last few months, but we're looking forward to seeing some more progress in that area. And let's say this is mostly it. The other topics are around security and reliability. But this is a good one. So we have to make sure that we can support whatever security model we need to, and that we can do so in a very reliable way, making sure essentially that every application can be onboarded without just being afraid regarding whether it's performance or who can penetrate the data or whether it complies with the standards required.
And Mark may be able to, I'm going to put him on the spot, because I think the networking area is an area where there's a lot of innovation, and it is relevant to enterprises trying to be able to provision environments for specific applications. A lot of that has to do with being able to create, manage your own network. So maybe you can take it on.
Yes, so one of the things for us that's really important as far as how we add features and talk about that is a little bit some of the innovations driven by some of the vendors who are pushing product, but also some of the innovations also driven by the users who present use cases that then the vendors go out and try to solve. And the one nice thing about networking is it's very pluggable, so there's a win for the vendors. But in terms of just community-wide, we take a look at how the networking allows you to bridge into your existing legacy applications into cloud, both public and private. We've been working in that direction. We've been adding more features to make the different components HA. Because one of the feedback we get as developers from some of the deployers is they'll start running the different various components at different scales, and the HA story for the different scales is vastly different. And so what we do is we take that information back. Currently right now we're re-architecting a little bit about how the network node works, how we can distribute load, how we can actually make some of the components run active-active versus active-passive, and really taking a look of hardening the system. But part of that is feeding back these stories, because people ask us how do features get in? Educating developers. Developers a lot of times have a very single narrow focus from either their employer or from their experience, and broadening out that is very important.
Yeah, I was glad you brought up the network, because that, in my experience, that's one of the things that causes a lot of issues with moving an existing environment to an OpenStack environment. Even if the application is conducive to a virtualized environment and conducive to running in an OpenStack environment, if it has a lot of dependencies on the network, and they went to a different networking department to go do that, and that department has no clue about anything related to cloud OpenStack. So the ability to make sure we can do things in a more automated way from a software-defined approach, so that you don't have to go physically touch the network and recable things, is a significant barrier right now. I know of one particular customer that I won't name did an excellent job in terms of an OpenStack implementation and actually re-architecting the application. they forgot about the network, and they realized that when they provisioned a new server, they needed IP addresses, and it still took them 10 days to get the IP addresses.
From our side as well, I think the thing that the foundation is moving towards is convergence of infrastructure as a service and platforms as a service. So if we think about the needs of an individual application to live in a VM somewhere, that's less about building really complicated infrastructure as a service elements, and that's about enabling people to build better PaaS elements, which takes some of that headache away from the individual application, and make that responsibility of a coordinated effort across a number of infrastructure components underneath. And I think one of the things that we love to drive people towards is how can you build your own PaaS? It's kind of like power PaaS. I give you all the components you need and put them together in a way that works for your business.
Chris, we had a conversation earlier, and I want to let the audience in on this conversation. You said that you believe that Rackspace and Amazon are not competing. Who in this room agrees, by the way? Nobody agrees. What do you think?
I can see how it looks. Time will prove me right. I believe that we have fundamentally different views around how we succeed in cloud. Amazon want to hit everyone, everywhere with their products and not necessarily their service. We want to hit as many people using the service element, right? There are lots and lots of really, really smart people who understand how cloud works and how to go and make money out of it. And they can go straight into Amazon and they can make that happen for a very small amount of money tomorrow. Our view is that that world was there back in the day when cloud didn't exist. There were still people who go and bought Colo, put their servers in it, and went and had a really great business model that worked for them. Rackspace was still a successful company back in those days when that happened, because there's a large proportion of people out there who need some help, who need some advice, who want that reassuring confidence level around them that if something goes wrong, when it all hits the fan, there's still someone there to help you pick up the pieces, to talk you through it, but also help showing you the way with new technology. So our play here has never been around the cheapest infrastructure in a public cloud. It's about giving customers the choice, providing the technology and all the pieces that differentiate Amazon free of charge, and making sure that you go buy from us because you value our service and nothing else.
So you're a services company?
Absolutely.
And yet you compete with Amazon on price, dropping prices when they do.
It's a necessary evil. Genuinely, I think there is a need to stay relevant in the public cloud market, but as our hybrid piece comes into the fore, so the combination of private and public, you're going to see an ability to hit price points that you can't hit solely in public cloud. Public cloud is a volatile business model where your customer may be a customer for 1 month, 1 week, or 1 year. The predictions you make around how you price your cloud are based on someone having zero customer loyalty. As we add private cloud into this, there's an element where you can bring in the concept of own the base and rent the spike. A base that you own on a private cloud with your own tin across a period of time will always work out more cost effective than a public cloud because you will engineer it to be. So what I'd say is we're cutting prices to keep public cloud relevant right now, but the goal here is to give a total cost of ownership which is far reduced from a purely public cloud play.
So wouldn't you say that in order for OpenStack to succeed at its mission, we need to see some large-scale, extremely large-scale providers come into the public market with OpenStack-based services?
I think vendor choice is absolutely crucial to OpenStack's success. Obviously, we have our products out there are other products out there as well. And we're trying to sponsor more of that stuff through our service provider program as well, where telcos can go and get Rackspace to build public clouds for them.
So where are the billion-dollar budgets that are backing major public cloud initiatives based on OpenStack?
I think it's a telco play. I mean, every telco in every region, in every country in the world wants to have a cloud play, a cloud product and service. OpenStack's a very interesting opportunity for them, but on its own, it's full of a lot of risks when they are a big telco which really doesn't understand what cloud is and how it works. So our service provider program is there to say if you want cloud but you don't have to think about it, there's a way forward.
Does Alcatel encourage service providers to compete with them the way Rackspace might be?
They're always encouraged to do so, but what we have seen is that service providers prefer to focus on what makes them unique gives them the revenue. And what we believe is that leveraging the platform that enables management of care in the cloud just can save you a lot of time, can save you a lot of money, because you would end up solving your problem this once. And yes, you can develop this infrastructure on your own. You can do everything that we did. I mean, it took us 2 years, and we got to a very good place, but everything can be done in a service provider. However, we believe that the expertise are more in other areas when it comes to service providers, and platform could be one, and that's a good solution.
Yeah, so I think we need to wrap up.
Yeah, we know better than to get between developers and a lunch. So let's elastically provision lunch. Nancy, please, everyone, thank our panel members.
Thank you, Shlomo, for leading an interesting panel. A few logistics before you go to lunch. One, before I forget, 12:30, there's going to be a siren check. Don't do anything, just stay in this